for YouTube? There we go. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs, the second portion of our committee work this afternoon, where we're continuing introductions of charter change bills. We're going to kick off with H474. This is a charter amendment for the city of Burlington. And Representative Mulvaney-Stanek, you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the bill?
Great. Well, hello, everyone. I'm State Representative Emma Mulvaney-Stanek. I represent a portion of Burlington, Chittenden 17, sort of half of the old North End, half of the new North End. And I'm here on behalf of my colleagues from Burlington, of course. This is the uniqueness of having multiple state reps from one city for a charter. So by no means is this represent just me. And so H474, and what I thought I would do, because you have a similar topic from another town right after me, is give you a little context on just cause eviction, especially for the new members. For those who were here last biennium, this will just be a refresher, not a pop quiz, but just a refresher of your memory of what the topic was last time, or deja vu. That's sometimes what happens here in this building. H474 is an attempt again to get the Burlington Charter through the legislative process. It was passed by voters in Burlington on March 2nd of 2021 by a 63.9% margin or majority in the city. And that passed, we have 8 wards in the city, that passed every single ward in the city of Burlington. And so what just cause is, just to kind of set the context. So currently under Vermont law allows termination of tenancy or for renters for no cause right now under Vermont law. So for example, a simple ending of a lease after 1 year of renting could be a reason for termination of a tenant, even if they fully paid their rent or they never violated a term of the lease and they were an upstanding tenant. Just the mere fact that the lease expired could be a cause for termination and eviction from the apartment or the unit. This creates a significant instability in our housing system. And as we've all heard exhaustively, really, in our own communities and throughout this entire session, is that we're facing a major housing crisis. And so anything that contributes to instability for people's secure housing should be a concern for policymakers. There's also no shield right now that protects tenants from a problematic or an unlawfully acting landlord in terms of their behavior as a landlord. And this includes issues of discrimination. So when a tenant tries to assert their fair housing rights, it's virtually impossible to prove because there's no cause eviction process right now. A tenant would have a very hard time proving that the eviction was due to discrimination, because right now you can be evicted for any reason, that no cause concept. Or when a tenant complains, and I had a family member in this situation in Burlington, about a safety or health issue in their apartment, there's no protection for that tenant from the landlord evicting them rather than making those upgrades in those apartments. And this is even in a city which arguably has the most robust code enforcement system in the entire state. And I know that's a luxury for Burlington, but even in the city of Burlington, and my family member was a tenant for multiple years, paid their rent on time, as a great tenant, and it was an issue of starting just to complain about some things that were starting to fall apart in the house in the apartment, and got evicted because there was just no process required to protect them as a tenant. Of course, not all landlords are problematic, and so what just cause eviction actually helps is to create a fair and transparent process for both the tenants and the landlords in the relationship. And this would create clear rules, which is such an important piece for both people going into the work of being a landlord and tenants going into the rental market, is to know what is expected of me, what's fair, and what's the transparent process that everyone needs to follow. Just going back briefly to the difficult housing crisis we're all facing, just cause eviction would create much needed stability, at least from the tenant side of things, and frankly for the landlords, as I said before, about a transparent and clear process. Burlington is experiencing an unprecedented low rental vacancy rate right now. Last fall, it was 0.4%. 0.4%. A healthy vacancy rate is somewhere more like 6%. I mean, it's really extreme. I can't imagine what it'd be like right now trying to find an apartment. And the systemic loss of housing entrenches people into poverty and inequity or inequality. So families who are evicted regularly lose all their possessions. They sometimes lose their jobs, and they experience high rates of depression and anxiety. And you think about the impacts of children in those families. There's worse outcomes for their education, their health, and the future earnings. And I live in a portion of the Old North End, and there's an apartment building right across. We're surrounded by apartment buildings. And I've witnessed, just by the chance of being home, 2 different forcible evictions for people. And whatever about this landlord, it is public record, I witnessed it. They literally threw these people's possessions out of the second-story window onto the lawn, the front lawn, right on Front Street in Burlington, Vermont, and then threw it in the back of a U-Haul and shipped it off. I mean, these evictions can be forceful, they're traumatic, and I just want to paint that picture because this happens on a frequent basis for folks, at least in my neighborhood, and without a fair and transparent process, this is what folks are experiencing through an eviction process. So Vermont Legal Aid did a report, and I believe it was in 2021, 2020, and I looked at the eviction cases in Chittenden County, and for the 4 years prior to that report, they noted 550 eviction cases just in Chittenden County alone. They later estimated that 20% of all eviction cases include no cause, meaning that there was no reason stated. It was just simply an eviction for the folks, again, despite if rent was paid on time, et cetera. Around 30% of the reasons within those cases were for reasons other than non-payment. So many people are evicted and they don't even contest it in court because, of course, some people don't do that because they just want to move on, or they don't have a lawyer, or they don't know how the process works. So those numbers are arguably pretty low considering the hot housing market and those power dynamics that happen between tenant and landlord. Just to the piece about power dynamics, just cause eviction would also address creating a better balance of power dynamics between the tenant and landlord. Right now, with our low vacancy rates, the high rents, and the desperation of renters trying to find housing, everything is really in the favor of landlords. And when you think about when landlords have more resources than a tenant, when they even get into an eviction dispute, for example, they're much more likely to have an attorney than a tenant would in those cases. And back to that legal aid report, 75% of those eviction cases, the landlord had an attorney and the tenant did not. So there's real power dynamics at play here as well. So just briefly, before I just walk you very briefly through the bill, because that's not necessarily my job, I'm here to tell you the why. The just cause eviction exists in 4 other states, the entire states, not just towns. And New Jersey has actually had it on the books since 1974. Also 2 cities, Seattle and Washington, D.C., have had it also on the books for their housing stock, I guess I'll just use that word. All right. So what the Burlington delegation decided to do in H474 for folks who are new is we went back to the original language approved by voters in 2021. We thought that would be good for a starting place. Those who were on the committee and in the legislature last year will remember House Gov Ops did make some amendments to the bill, which I'm happy to go into at a later point, or I'm sure Tucker can go into at a later point, or other advocates. But essentially the language before you is what was approved in 2021. And there's 4 sections. It defines just cause. For the reasons you could be evicted would include a material breach of a written rental agreement, a tenant's violation of state statute, non-payment of rent, obviously, or a failure to accept reasonable good faith renewal terms by the landlord. So that would be what the definition of just cause would be. In the next section, it goes into what would be excluded from just cause, and that would include specifically just the expiration of the rental agreement as the sole means for why you would terminate someone's lease or their apartment rental. And that, again, is going back to what I said before. Right now, just because your lease ends, it is a reason people use to evict, and that is an unjust way of creating a lot of insecurity in the housing world for folks. It also would exempt sublets and in-unit rentals, or owner-occupied duplexes and triplexes, or units that are being withdrawn from the rental market because the owner wants an immediate family member to move in, or themselves, so an owner-occupied, or because the owner is going to use the property for that purpose, or finally to make substantial renovations and so much so that the apartment could not be lived in because the renovations were so significant. The third section goes into other pieces that, and again, this would be further developed with the ordinance. If this charter were approved by the city of Burlington, then they would get into the details. But the third section gets into mitigating potential negative impacts on tenants and property owners, including adequate notice and reasonable relocation expenses related to the eviction. So they would get into those details. It would get into defining what a probationary period would mean. So if you brought on a new tenant, how long would there be a probation period so that things didn't work out, that you still had as a landlord the ability to evict someone if they were just not a good fit, but within a defined probationary period. So that would be defined. And limiting unreasonable rent increases. And this is an important one, especially in this housing market, because an unreasonable spiking in rent can de facto become an eviction. So this, in 2021, voters approved this language to specifically make sure that that would not be allowed. If it was an unreasonable spiking in rent, that would be a factor there. And then finally, the last section was just getting more into details of making sure the definition of reasonable and adequate notice was defined under ordinance. So that is the charter as passed by the voters of Burlington. And we hope that it has a successful path through this session, go through this committee, and then ultimately through the governor. Happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Representative Mulvaney-Stanek? Representative Murowicki?
I'm sorry for coming in late. Did you mention how the vote went already?
Yes, so the vote was, I'm happy to repeat it again. So it was approved by 63.9% of voters. We had 14,016 voters total in that election cycle, and all 8 wards of Burlington passed it. Yes, of course.
So the few of us who were on House Gov Ops last biennium will remember this well. Are there any key differences between this language and the language we saw before? Yes. So it was added under that first section about what just cause can include, so that definition, and 3 pieces were added in the process. One was it could be a just cause eviction if there was substantial damage done to the property by the tenant, a member of the tenant's household, or a guest. The second piece that was added to that definition was the behavior of the tenant, so members of the tenant's household or guests that adversely affects the health and safety of other tenants, the landlord or the landlord's representative. And then finally, criminal activity on the premises of the rental property or any criminal threat against the landlord or landlord's representative. So those were all added as reasons for a just eviction. The committee or the process also added, let's see, in the third section, it was around reasonable relocation expenses and sort of an estimate of not to exceed the value of 1 month's rent or another amount negotiated by the landlord tenant. And I believe there was something else in there about the potential negative impacts to small landlords. You'll have to go look back on that one. I never asked Tucker about that particular one. And those were the main changes in the final version that voted out of the House Gov Ops. I'd represent Murowicki.
Just to go back to the vote, I don't see that on our page.
Yeah.
If you could give that to our assistant, they can post that. I think that's important information for whoever reports the bill.
Yeah.
And I just, my own opinion is, I feel our job is to respect the will of local voters, especially with substantial vote like that. And there's a lot of, it's said about local votes, local control, and I think I'm not sure, I feel my job is to start to tinker with what has been done on a local level, but to support it. That's helpful information.
Yeah, of course. No, I'm happy to do that. And I'm happy to email that to your assistant. And to that point, Representative Murphy, when we were going back to, this charter that still hasn't passed through the process, the delegation had a conversation of, do we go back to honoring what was passed by the voters versus starting where the bill left off last? And we thought we should at least start from where voters and the will of the voters were at that time. So that's why we gave you the first version of the charter.
Representative Hooper, and then I want to make sure that, because today we're basically doing kind of just a brief introduction of different bills, and that this one's tied because it's similar subject matter to the Winooski charter. I just want to make sure we kind of get to that, and the opportunity will, if we pick these back up, to dive in and learn more about the issue. And folks who weren't around last time will have plenty of time to ask questions and hear from folks. But please go ahead, Representative Hooper.
Mr. Chair, some of what you said. As to Representative Stanek's last point, we did take a good bit of time to look through this and the other provisions of the charter that were changed. It shouldn't necessarily take another deep dig, I would think, but we did move it forward.
Well, thank you, Representative Mulvaney Stanek. I'm sure we'll be in touch if we have questions along the way.
Maybe I'll see you soon with the 4 other ones that.
Yes.
Easier.
Just got those today, so they're not quite. We're working our way through. It's charter season. Great. So I'm wondering if it makes sense, Representative Small, to have you come and talk about H 499, and then we'll have legislative council.
Yes, that sounds great to me. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Representative Taylor Small of Winooski here. Just to start, I will say that I'm not going to get into the policy language in the bill because it is exactly the same as Burlington. So to reduce redundancy, I'll just talk about the specifics when we're looking at Winooski. And I think one of the most important points that I want to level set is that Winooski is the most densely populated and most diverse city in northern New England. And we also have about 67% of our Winooski housing units are rental units. Not that this is a brag, but that is more rental units than our neighbor in Burlington. And the issue of no cause evictions is really clear in Winooski. As some of you might know, the example from just last year, we had major landlords from Chittenden County who threatened to evict 24 low-income, mostly refugee families who were living at a housing complex right on Main Street. These were families that whose kids needed English language learning services at our school that were going to be pushed out of Winooski because of the low turnover rate when it came to rental units. And luckily, because it got such publicity, city leadership and community members stepped in to not only fundraise for these families, but ultimately move the landlords to not evict them and use a process that actually updated the units while maintaining them in housing. But this is not a unique situation. As just one of a handful of legislators here that is also a renter, I was no cause evicted from my first ever rental unit in Winooski. Similar to Burlington, we have a health code policy, and we have folks who are able to enforce health code violations. And so after talking with my landlord about the black mold and rats, the infamous Winooski River rats, in my apartment, those reports forced the landlord to have to make some changes, of course, to make a safe environment for me to live in and my roommates to live in. And because of that notification to my landlord, I was then not offered the opportunity to re-sign a lease. I was told that I was no longer a good fit and that they would be finding someone else to go in. And so I think that's the struggle when it comes to no cause evictions. No cause evictions open the door for discrimination when it comes to housing. If landlords have the opportunity and right to say, you are just not a good fit, there's no due process. You can't go to a court and argue whether or not I'm a good fit for this landlord or not. And so what just cause eviction is asking for is for landlords to have a documented reason as to why that eviction is happening in the first place. So to get off my soapbox, I'm going to now talk about the charter change itself. So this was a voter petition charter change with support from Rights and Democracy that received 276 signatures from Winooski voters to get it on the ballot initially. I will note that due to logistical difficulties, some turnover in city staff, new council, the charter change language was not properly warned before the vote. But our city staff and advocates were able to provide significant public education around the impacts of the charter change, including a thorough one-pager, at least 2 educational events, matched with public hearings at the city council level. So this charter change received 73% of the vote on town meeting day. But for legal purposes, there will be a validation vote that will be happening in March of 2024 during our next town meeting day, as we did not see that it would be beneficial or a true validation vote to do a special election when folks might not know that an election is happening in the first place. But I would say the resounding 73% shows that the people of Winooski are very much in support of this charter change to begin with. I thought you might have questions about this. So in discussion with our city manager, who consulted with the Secretary of State's office, the validation vote does not stop the legislature from moving forward on the charter change. As you see before you, it can still be created into a bill. And if passed, it will go back to city council and they are able to create the just cause eviction ordinances. We are still seeking clarity as to what would happen if the validation vote did not pass. But again, a very unlikely scenario and one that we are not expecting.
A little bit of an unusual situation in that, so if I'm understanding this correctly, the charter was on the ballot, but it wasn't properly warned. So the question was there, but the warning for the charter was not done in accordance with state laws. Am I understanding that correctly?
You are correct. And truly the confusion was that this was the first petition-based ballot initiative that had come to Winooski under a new set of city staff. So there was a lot of learning in the process. And because of that, it delayed to actually just a few days after the warning period as to when it should move forward. But there was confidence from city leadership and staff that the people of Winooski were duly warned and educated about the charter change prior to the election.
So was it about the form of the warning or about the timing?
It was about the timing. It was just days late.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. Representative McGrath.
So that, I'm sure we'll hear from Ledge Council, that seems material, but in terms of the city only, in terms of legislative action, we can do whatever we want, whenever we want. So if we see justification, somebody put a bill forward, we should be able to act on it.
Yeah, I think
That would be the question that's out there.
Yeah, I think we want to talk to legislative council and also think about the precedent. We're, to represent Murwicki's point, we want to respect the will of the voters and take up charters. We also have to think about, constitutionality and process and make sure we're getting it right. So I'm not completely shutting the door on the idea that we should take a look at some of these issues that have, clearly been before the voters, but we also want to think about the context as well. Those are, I appreciate Representative Small putting it right out there in the beginning of this particular bill discussion that there's this question about how the question was warned, and we'll take more testimony and understand the context before we take any action. Other questions for Representative Small about H 499? I will invite legislative council up. Thank you, Representative Small.
Thank you.
Joining us today.
You say the average Winooski River rat is.
You're big.
It's true.
Can't even.
You thought you might stay.
All about perspective.
Good afternoon, Tucker Anderson, Legislative Council.
Ashley Angel, Law Clerk, Legislative Council.
Ashley worked on the Winooski Charter since they're materially the same language. Thought come up here together since you've taken a look at both of them at the same time. And starting with H 474, the critical subject for the day in section 2 is that there's a technical correction in section 46. I'm being facetious. I did want to note that in addition to the just cause eviction components of H 474, the city did notice that way back in the 90s, back when I was in grade school, so I'm not responsible for this, Legislative Council inadvertently eliminated the word "not" in a section of law related to when the mayor has to return and answer on whether or not the mayor is going to veto an ordinance adopted by the city council. So based on some historical research and a lot of input from the Burlington City Attorney, just wanted to note that the word "not" has returned to its rightful place within section 46. Jumping to just cause eviction. Would you like, high-level overview, discussion of the details here, maybe highlighting some of the principles up front so that you can then talk about the Winooski scenario that was described.
Yeah, so I think, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this today. So I think framing some of the principles and then a high level overview of what's in here. So things we can look at as we sort of do our homework and think about who we need to hear from. If we're going to do a deeper dive, that would be really helpful.
All right, I'll try not to steamroll Ashley's Winooski presentation and note up front that what you're dealing with in both bills, and we covered this during the day one introduction to what is a charter, why do you get them, why is the General Assembly even involved in this language? The answer is this is your power. This is state legislative power that is being delegated to a subordinate unit of local government for a specific purpose. This is a delegation of legislative authority. You should look at this the same way as you delegate authority to the executive branch for specific purposes, otherwise known as rulemaking. And that's going to help guide you through understanding both of the charter proposals and some of the policy decisions you may have to make with respect to the Winooski Charter. And pausing there to jump to Representative Hooper's statement, yes, the General Assembly can do whatever it wants, whenever it wants. However, the great constraint on the plenary authority of the General Assembly is the Vermont Constitution. And I'll note up front that there would be no constitutional barriers to approving the Winooski Charter and delegating the authority, despite the procedural defect that may or may not have existed during the charter vote. So hopefully that will help pave way for your decision. The discussion around delegation of authority is also going to help you understand what's happening in this language. So you heard that in the first subdivision of this language, where it describes what is not just cause eviction, or what constitutes just cause for purposes of just cause eviction. You're establishing a process here where eviction of tenants is essentially becoming a judicial process for every single instance. So by defining just cause, you are here defining what a landlord will be able to use to demonstrate as part of that judicial process that this is a just basis for an eviction under the ordinance that is adopted. Skip through a little bit here and note that same consideration.
Nugent had a question.
If it's okay to ask now, because that's kind of what my question is. I was just wondering how that intersects with lease law, and if someone is planning to change the use of their property entirely or sell it or something, would this still apply and not let them, do they have to assume that they're going to be renting their space forever, basically?
So in the great volume known as stuff Tucker's not an expert in, landlord-tenant law is going to fall into a lot of that. So my general response from the part of my brain that does exist is that anything that is not delegated within the four corners of this bill to the city of Burlington and that does not end up in the ordinance is going to be harmonized with the general law in Title IX that governs residential leases. So it would probably be helpful as you move forward with this to get an understanding of how those Title IX provisions are going to harmonize, match up with whatever the city is going to adopt.
Thank you.
Next note on the delegation, you're going to want to look at the scope of what's being delegated to the cities under both of these bills. What exactly is the authority? What are they allowed to construct? Make the policy choice that you want to pass this authority on. And the question is going to be, does it meet constitutional standards for delegations of legislative authority? And perhaps the question that you want to ask is, have we answered the fundamental question, which might be the new basis for evaluating legislative delegations under some U.S. Supreme Court decisions that have just come out. But have you provided explicit enough authority that the cities are going to be able to adequately exercise their regulatory authority in this space? Which brings me to subsection D, which is granting the authority for some of these terms to be defined by the city council is ultimately going to impact what the scope of the just cause eviction ordinances will be. So you'll note that in that subdivision D, the city council through the ordinance is able to define what is, quote, reasonable, where that term is used throughout both this authority and their ordinance, and adequate notice. So you have some procedural considerations there.
Representative Hoover.
So you just brought to mind an either exceptionally brilliant or conventionally stupid question. Where do we approach the point that someone living in Barry, or take your pick of any other city that does not have this legal protection granted to them citizen-wise, where we run afoul of the equal protection clause?
I don't think that you would. Where you might run into an issue with that would be within the four corners of the ordinance adopted by the city if they were treating the rights of individuals within the city differently based on some sort of protected status. So the answer is you would not have an equal protection claim between citizens of different municipalities with different jurisdictional authority.
So Burlington and Winooski will go to the protection of the court. Barry will not.
Correct. Unless they have, again, this is in that gray zone between the giant volume of stuff I don't know in my functioning brain, is that there are some appeals processes that do go before what are known as housing boards of review, which don't exist in every single municipality in the state because they have to be established by the municipality, and it requires the municipality to adopt ordinances, which some of them are loath to do. But I do know that the city of Barry at least used to have a housing board of review in their charter.
Any other questions for Tucker at this point? So I would encourage folks to think about who they want to hear from. We will be taking a little bit more of a look into some of the just the pieces and questions for us to consider when it comes to these just cause eviction charter changes. I believe that there's even a third community that adopted a just cause eviction charter amendment, but we haven't seen the bill from them yet because that was just done. So this is an issue that several communities are taking a look at, and I want us to understand what the ask is and what some of the implications are for us. So we will put this in the bucket of ones we're not moving on tomorrow. Even some of the more straightforward bills we will be taking action on pretty quickly. So Tucker, go ahead.
I wanted to answer a question that I had flagged in my brain that came up earlier, which was, I think, from Representative Small, what happens if the future 2024 validation vote fails, but this charter passes and they already have the authority? The answer is, as soon as this is enacted, the city's going to have the authority. It's been delegated by the General Assembly. So the validation vote won't affect the delegation of that power to the city. It's going to be up to the city at that point as to whether they want to adopt an ordinance if it isn't validated by the voters. But they will have your power to do so if they want to.
That also assumes that we enact this without waiting for the validation vote.
That is correct.
Lots of choices that we have to make here in House GovOps. And I know our folks from St. Johnsbury are here for our last charter bill introduction of the day. So so Ashley, did you want to tell us anything more about Winooski before we move on, or should we just have you back when we come back to it? Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Sorry, you guys.
Tucker's explanation is basically the same explanation that I had for H 499. The only difference is that this particular bill has 3 sections rather than 4. There is no mayoral provision to this bill. So other than that, it is the exact same.
Good to know. We will know that Winooski does not have a technical correction around any mayor. Thank you very much, Ashley.
I want to talk about plenary lights.
Do I want to go into a constitutional law?
So thank you very much, Representative Beck and Representative Campbell, for your patience here. H503 is amendments to the Charter of St. Johnsbury. So Representative Beck, do you guys want to come up together?
I think that's fine.
Johnsbury delegation.
Well, I think we'll turn it over to Tucker here pretty quickly to go through it. From what I understand, this was approved by our voters, obviously. And we'd hope to get it to you a little bit quicker than that, but Tucker, there was some drafting challenges, I think, as far as how it arrived. The changes in here, I would say are not enormous changes, a lot of housekeeping. But I think the drafting challenges, I think, are really what you will be focused on. And Tucker's probably much better, more capable of explaining that, how it fits into the Constitution than I am. So that's probably all I have to say at this point. I want to add some stuff.
And my understanding, I wasn't really involved in the process, but my understanding was that it was really a matter of updating the language. It was not, there were no substantive changes, as I understand it. And then we have a side-by-side, I think did you forward that to?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know whether you all have it. We have a copy here on 11/17 if nobody wants to see it.
Guess not.
Yeah, I don't know that we get it side by side. So
No. Oh, no.
the bill is, but a side by side comparison between the existing charter and
The stricken portion.
It's a side-by-side that was created by the town, not Ledge Council.
Yes.
Just to be clear.
Okay. And yeah, it was
But yeah, it was largely a housekeeping bill, largely.
So are there any things that are in the charter and therefore in this book? Because it looks like it's pretty much the entire charter is like struck and then recreated with updated language.
Yes, and reorganized so that it's sort of easier to follow. And if you look at some of the original language, I don't know when it dates from, but it looks pretty archaic.
Yeah, it was dated, so.
And just some of the things that usually come up, like if I'm reading this correctly, the clerk is elected.
Correct.
And will remain elected in your charter here. So I note that a number of the charter bills we had last biennium and that we have now relate to moving from elected to appointed. And by getting out of general law and keeping, it sounds like there's still a desire to just keep it having an elected clerk.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there anything in this that was controversial at all that we should be kind of looking out for?
No, there were some controversial ideas, but they did not make it in.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, good to know.
I'm curious.
Yeah. You'll have to.
Discussions about special services district, which is police and who would pay, those are pretty contentious issues. There's also an ongoing debate. We've moved to Australian ballot, and it's been good in some ways and not good in others. But those issues were left out of this conversation.
So the move to Australian ballot happened and is perpetuated by this.
It's probably been 15 years, but the decreased involvement is the downside that we've experienced because of that. But we chose not to tackle that in this charter change.
Oh, here, I just found the email. with the side by side, if I could forward it to.
Yeah, please do, and we'll get it posted.
Very helpful.
I'm sorry, what's your?
Andrea Hussey is our committee assistant, diligent, hardworking. You are totally awesome, makes our lives easier.
Exceedingly above that.
Great, well, we'll invite, if there's nothing else you want to leave us with, we'll invite Ledge Council to give us a high level. We'll add this to our list for future testimony, and if I imagine that there were local officials that were involved in the change, we might want to hear from folks if there's anybody that we should be hearing from.
Yeah, be the town manager.
The town manager.
He's the chair of the process.
Okay, great. Well, we'll invite your town manager to come and join us in the next few days here when we pick this back up.
Andrew, did you get that?
We'll make sure we got it, Scott. Tucker, welcome back.
Thank you all for having me again. So you have in front of you H503. I would generally agree with the statement that the majority of the bill would be non-substantive changes, cleanup, reorganization to the St. Johnsbury Charter. You will note that towards the end of the bill, there's actually quite a few what we call pure redesignations, where the town was proposing to delete and replace sections, but they were just copying and pasting over the exact same language that existed in another section of the charter. So to make it so that that's not perceived as the delegation of new authority in a new context, this has been drafted so that that's just a redesignation of existing language, so that you're not approving something that was approved in 1947 without any substantive change to the language. There are some new provisions being proposed by the town. So, quickly note that there's some changes to town offices, to the officers within the town, to authority of the town and the town select board. There's some procedural changes to the town manager's appointment and removal, provisions related to the town manager generally. And I'll note that something that you will definitely want to do with the very helpful side-by-side provided by the town, and I'll work probably with Ashley, spoiler, Ashley, this is going to be some of your work, to take a look at what is changing in the language. Even though it's being reorganized and moved around, the town is eliminating a lot of language that existed, especially with respect to the downtown district in the charter as it exists now. So of course, this being a large collection of a delegation of legislative authority, you'll want to understand how that might be interpreted in the future and where the town is shifting from its charter specific authority to general authority for municipalities. The other thing that I would note, two more things. So drafting this did take a little while, but the biggest issue was that the charter amendments passed by the town had errors in cross-references between charter sections, and they were substantive errors, and I didn't know how to fix them without input from the town. So they stayed in the bill as introduced, but you're going to want to hear from the town that I didn't inadvertently introduce a mistake by trying to figure out what the correct cross-references were. That's what took a while. The last thing that I'll note is that there is a provision in here that I have briefed the committee on in the past. It has come up for a number of other chartered municipalities as a proposal. It's on page 29. It's in section 802 of the proposed bill. And this would authorize the town to adopt any charter provision approved for any other municipality without seeking approval from the General Assembly. As I've noted in the past, any delegation of legislative authority that lets anyone besides the legislature adopt statutes, particularly statutes that allow them to aggrandize their authority and power without legislative approval, is likely, very likely unconstitutional, and I can provide you with 12 cases about municipalities that deal with unconstitutional delegations of legislative authority, and probably 30 cases generally dealing with this sort of unconstitutional provision.
All right, now I'm going to have to read H503 very carefully. So I will tell the delegation from St. Johnsbury that it has long been the job of House GovOps to tell towns that, nice try, but sorry, we're not going to delegate any authority to you just because. So we probably will be removing that section from future drafts of your charter change bill.
Understood.
That's true.
Does anybody on the committee have questions about that specific? So this has been I would say there have been many municipalities who, when they bring charter changes, have added language like this or similar, where they basically say, hey, if it's good for one town, we should be able to adopt that without having to go and ask for a charter change. I think there are obvious, given the work that we've done on a few of these charters, there are obvious challenges with that because not all towns have the same charter. And so bringing in a language and in what form that language would come in, and it would sort of upend the whole nature of our Dillon's Rule authority that we have. But if folks have questions about that, I think this is the first one we've had this year, isn't it? Yeah, all right. First one. St. Johnsbury gets the prize.
Almost got it right.
It's hard to get that one by Tucker, I think. All right. Anything else? Any other little grenades in here that you want to share?
Landmines.
Landmines. Okay, there we go.
This is why we need this second.
When we do the walkthrough, I can point out some of the provisions that are new. There's one other interesting thing here, and I don't think this is unconstitutional. I'm only flagging it because you deal with it so much. They're proposing, they actually already have the authority to dissolve fire districts unilaterally. So I thought that I would point that out. But they added some language to allow existing debt services to be assessed as special assessments to properties within the fire districts. So an interesting point that the town of St. Johnsbury, at least to my knowledge, might be the only town that allows fire districts to self-dissolve.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea when that Section 807 was originally?
I don't, but I can absolutely take a look. I'd be curious to see if it is contemporaneous with the Title 20 provisions that allow the creation of fire districts. Again, there's nothing per se unconstitutional about allowing municipal corporations like those districts to self-dissolve. The concern is always that same concern with any other corporation. If they dissolve, but they still have debts, those creditors are unable to get that debt back.
The entity no longer exists.
Right. And when we deal specifically with government corporations, the risk there is that the voters are putting themselves on the line through their representatives in the district. Those are bonded debts. So if you erase the corporation, but bonded debts still exist, the question is, where does it go? And maybe that's something that St. Johnsbury has addressed here with this special assessment language, but we'll dig into it when you do your walkthrough.
What's the debt default to? Yeah. Sorry, I'm thinking out loud. I'll shut up.
Yeah, I think they tried to resolve it here, but we'll definitely. Yeah, the individual people.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that question. I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tucker. Any other questions? All right. Well, that was a lot,
but not for now.
That was a lot in a brief period of time. I know my brain is a little full, so we're gonna wrap up a little early. We will get back at it tomorrow morning and take up some of these more straightforward ones. I'll be looking to weave in further testimony on some of the policy heavy charter changes that have been brought before us, and we'll have some decisions to make about how we move those forward and when. So we'll try to tackle some of these easy ones in the morning. I don't know if everybody was in the room, but just to repeat myself here, the ones that looked really straightforward, 488, the Ludlow Charter, 489, the Shelburne local option tax, and 495, the town of Middlebury is just about their treasurer moving from elected to appointed. So I think we can move those along pretty quickly. Do some digging in and learning about municipal utilities with the Lindenville and Linden merger. That's H490. These just cause eviction questions are pretty thorny from what our testimony was before. I just want to make sure before we schedule to move those that we've heard from folks and gotten the committee up to speed. Four of us had significant testimony and heard some pretty powerful testimony about just cause eviction in the last session, but we've got some significant work to do there. And I think with 503 that we just heard, we just need to delve in and understand some of the details a little bit more, and probably have the town manager in, but I don't anticipate, other than the little the broad expansion of municipal authority section that was in there, that we will have too many challenges with that one. So anything that we need to get on the table before we break for the day? All right, everybody, thanks for hanging in there. I know this was a lot to do in one afternoon, so it's important to all these towns. So I appreciate everybody's diligence, and we'll be back at it tomorrow. Representative Byron and I have a meeting in the morning, so we won't be starting tomorrow morning until 9:30. 9:30. So, yeah. Wednesday. It's been a long week already. Second day of our legislative representative hangover. I love it. It's a rough one. Great. Well, with that.